Hello again and welcome. I'm Steve Peterson, Associate Chair of Minnesota Atheist and the host for this program. Periodically throughout the program, contact information for Minnesota Atheist will come up, and if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. On this program, we're interviewing two guests from Compassion and Choices, a national organization that works in quality of life choices and end of life choices. Compassion and Choices is a nonprofit organization working to improve and expand choice at the end of life. As a national organization with over 60 chapters and 30,000 members, they help patients and their loved ones face the end of life with calm facts and choices of action during a difficult time. We also aggressively pursue legal reform to promote pain care, put teeth into advance directives, and legalize physician aid in dying. I have a personal interest in this as I've been part of the predecessor group to Compassion and Choices of Minnesota as a board member a few years back. And my wife, who's on the camera that faces me here, was one of the founders of the organization, of the local chapter here a number of years ago. And with me today I have Janet Kahn, who's a retired Target account manager, and long supporter of liberal political activities. Okay. And Sarah Lasik, who is a doctoral student and working with research and focus in an area of family caregiving and end-of-life issues. Welcome, Sarah and Janet.
Thank you.
Janet, we'll start with you because you're both board members of Compassion and Choices of Minnesota, a chapter of Compassion and Choices nationally. And I had alluded that this had a little bit of evolution. It used to be the Hemlock Society. Do you want to give a little history of it?
Okay. In the beginning, which is in the late 80s, there was the Hemlock Society, which was founded by Derek Humphreys. And that provided information about basically end-of-life choices for several years. And in the last couple of years, the organization made a decision to get more involved in legislative issues and not just helping on a one-by-one case basis, but to try to strengthen the laws to protect our rights. Mm-hmm. And so the name was changed to End of Life Choices because we felt that better portrayed what we were about, and it basically sounded better than the Hemlock Society. And then, just about a year after that happened, we've then merged with another group that was interested in the same issues, Compassion in Dying. So we changed our name again, and now it's Compassion and Choices to encompass what both groups are interested in.
And Derek Humphreys, we interviewed him on this program probably about well, it was more than 10 years ago. Or
he's still active.
He's still active. I know.
Absolutely.
He has his own unique expertise that he brings in. He kind of, we interviewed him as he had, and Sarah, are you familiar with his choice, Final Exit and Beyond Final Exit, the two books by him?
Yep, I've read them both.
We interviewed him, I think, when Beyond Final Exit came out. And he was kind of working with people who were in very desperate need of trying to figure out how to end their life. So he's gone a little bit his own way, isn't that?
Right. I think he's working with a group now called Final Exit Network, and they also are in the same area. We would all consider ourselves, you might call it right to die groups or death with dignity groups. And their group is more focused simply on the work with individuals and with exploring what they call technologies for the final exit, which is not something that we get into. And they were not interested in doing the legislative work. So we're both part of the same movement.
Yeah, but Compassion and Choices is Sarah, how did you get involved in Compassion and Choices? Or
I actually became a board member when I've taken care of an older woman that's in her 80s for about 4 years, and she used to be a member, and have long been passionate about end-of-life issues from my work in gerontology, and wasn't aware of the organization. So she made me aware of that about 3 years ago and started attending the meetings, and one thing led to another and became a board member.
And,
We
and
were
you
pleased
became
to
a
re-
board
I
member.
did.
Wow.
We're pleased to recruit her. Absolutely.
But the issue is not for people who might have been of retirement age. Janet, as you're retired from your regular employment, and some of us are close to it, we think about a lot more. You've got a ways to go, so you're thinking about this in a much more broad spectrum.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the things that drew me to the organization is that for so many younger people, I'm in my 20s, and we'll allude later to the Terry Schiavo case, but things where people are younger and death and dying doesn't affect people just in their middle adult years and in their later adult years, but certainly when they're younger. And also in thinking about, say, my parents or people my age dealing with older relatives, it's certainly an issue that's going to be, transcends through all the ages, not just middle and older adulthood. So,
I'm on the advanced wave of the baby boomers, and it seems to me that all the people my age and within the 10 years younger are dealing now with aging parents, and it's a very difficult issue, and it's very difficult to talk about what do you want to do when you die or when you're dying, and I have to admit that I never had those conversations with my parents, and we all sort of were on the same wavelength, but no one ever had that explicit conversation because it is awkward and scary. And so one of the things that our group wants to do is to help people have those conversations and prepare themselves. And we're not saying there's one way that you should be doing it. We're not saying how your life should end and what your choices would be, but to make sure that you've thought it through, that you know what options are available to you, and then you've taken some steps to ensure that those wishes will be observed when the time comes. And one of the ways we promote the use of the Advanced Healthcare Directive, which does two things. It names an agent or a proxy who will speak for you if you can't speak for yourself, and it also then spells out in more or less detail, depending on, it's up to the individual, what kinds of guidelines you do want to follow. For instance, would you want artificial hydration and feeding if you were in such and such a state? Would you want extreme surgical measures to be taken if you were dying of cancer? And you can't just say this once in your life and then that's it for the next 40 years, because your ideas will change and your circumstances will change, and it makes a real difference what your choices would be when you were 40, whereas if you're 80, what kinds of, how far you want to go in prolonging death or prolonging life, which we sometimes think in our medical age becomes prolonging death.
We have a copy here of the Minnesota. Now, this program goes around in different areas of the country, so if it's a different state, your law may be different in that. But in Minnesota, there is a Minnesota Healthcare Directive, and this is done by the University Extension Service. And you might know what's contained in here a little bit more. But
well, that's a little package that we put together while using what was done with the university. It's got about 16 pages of worksheets for you to sort of think through what your options are and think about the topic and put down your thoughts. And then there's the specific form itself, which is, the form is pretty much dictated by
the form
law.
is, this is the law.
To be legal in Minnesota.
Correct, and it's actually only 4 pages.
Right.
And 1 page is really just having the signatures properly done.
Right.
But it sets out the importance of having primary health care, alternative health care agent. So that would be under the old living will, that'd be the proxy person.
Right.
And,
right. A lot of people still call it the living will, but the terminology changes, but it's the same idea to say in what circumstances you'd want what kinds of care choices.
So what this has is you have your primary agent and your alternative. Have you then are you a primary agent for anybody in your family? I'm a primary agent, and but I have an alternative in our family for my folks, and for both Shirley and I, we have primaries and alternatives. Do you do some of that too, or?
Yep, I am a primary agent for one of my family members, and then 2 other individuals that are non-family members that chose to have someone other than their family members be their primary agent.
Well, that's always got to be a little bit of a, do they have other than family members. I can see that enforcing that could be a kind of a difficult routine. I'm that way with somebody else who's a non-family member.
True.
But we've talked about it a fair amount, and we've discussed it. And I'm actually only that because his family is very distant. It's not immediate. And so there's no immediate family members. So there's probably not going to be somebody coming in going, well, I want to overrule this.
Right.
But if you're the primary agent on this form and a family member comes in, it's very difficult to overrule it, isn't it?
It sure can be, and that's why it's so important to have that in writing, and also if there are family members, to let them know that there is someone else designated, and also to let the physician and healthcare providers know who the primary contact would be, especially if it's not family members. Otherwise, you're right, that could get overruled if people aren't aware of it.
Well, that's what's kind of nice about this extension form. There's extra pages you can fill out on it that cover a lot of different circumstances.
Right. I mean, it would be ideal to have your closest family member be your primary, but there are reasons not to do that. And one reason is practical, as you say. If they all live 1,000 miles away and you're in a car accident or something, they're not going to be there to work with the doctors if they need to. But the other thing is that there can be real disagreements within a family about what is proper to do and what you ought to do, and you have to recognize that. So the person that, even a spouse, might not be the person to do it because they would say, well, no, you can't choose that. That would be wrong. And you have to make sure that your agent is somebody who really is on the same wavelength you are. And if you have to choose somebody who's not in your family, hopefully at least you can explain it to your family that that's why you've done it, so you're going to minimize any conflict at the end. It's also possible that sometimes people don't want to leave those choices with their closest loved one because they know how hard it would be for that person to say, okay, it's time to stop the treatment, it's time to take off the respirator. It's hard to let go, and it's hard to be the one to do that. And so you have to have somebody who's willing to bite the bullet and do it.
Be a little bit objective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been through that with a couple family members because I've thought about all these issues. This isn't an issue that was new for me. I've actually thought about it 20 years ago. But an experience within our own family where, as my folks were afraid to really come up to this subject because they had a superstition of, I do this preparation, I might die.
Yeah.
That preparation somehow has a correlation with what might happen. And when they overcame it, then they put it away, and it was, but when we actually had to utilize it for my stepfather, who was virtually my father, it's a tough thing to do, but there's a certain point to where there was really nothing else to do. And my mother was the primary, but she just said, what does everybody think? So this was really a family decision that it came to. But she had a tough time making that choice if she was to do it only herself.
My sister was hospitalized and had been in ill health, and she went into a coma, and she wasn't coming out, and it had been like a week, and we knew she had very strong feelings that she did not want to be in the persistent vegetative state, or somebody kept alive with tubes and so on. And I actually wasn't her primary, her good friend was, but I was the secondary, and we worked together. And the doctors kept saying, well, we're going to try this, and we're going to do that, and so on. And we had a couple of meetings with the doctors, and we said, okay, well, let's try for another week. And then we had the next meeting, and they said, well, this hasn't worked, but we're going to try something or other. And at that point, we said, wait, hold it. I think it's time to stop. I don't think she's coming back.
Yeah.
And
at what point do you cause more harm than you actually do
and
good?
the thing was that as soon as we said that, they were absolutely fine with that because she had a very clear directive, so there was no ambiguity. They knew that that was the right thing to do. But we sort of wondered if we hadn't ever spoken up, whether they would have just kept trying stuff for who knows how long, indefinitely.
The medical industry is there to keep you alive.
Right.
that's really what drives them. You've worked, is this part of your study at all, how the medical field actually, they're there to keep you alive. Unless
Yeah.
there's somebody to not
Right.
tell them no, their real objective is do whatever they can to
Yeah.
keep it. Is that
death,
correct?
Death is a failure in the medical world, so.
And that's why you need to have the agent and not just the written directive, because you can say what your wishes are. Your doctor could have a copy of that.
Yeah.
But the machine starts rolling, and
Yeah.
you need a person to stand up and say, stop at some point, or go another direction, or whatever, whichever direction it is that you want. Somebody has to be there to speak for you. And so that's another consideration in choosing your agent, somebody who isn't afraid to speak up.
Yeah, yeah. I actually did that with my stepfather when I told the doctor, and this was in a small town in Minnesota, in a very small hospital. I said, he has a health care directive, and he doesn't want to be sitting in here on these things. And he just looked at me, and I don't know if it was true or not. He just said, well, I've read his health care directive, and we'll talk about it more, but and I really don't know if he had, but I think he went back and read it at that point. And but it did let that doctor know that, well, wait a minute, we've been through this already. His consciousness, and he had died from Parkinson's. He couldn't swallow or anything like that, so it was really a feeding situation. And he was clear in that directive that that's not what he wanted, that was a point to where if he wasn't able to take nourishment on his own, that was the time to say no. And at his point in life, and he lived a long life, a good life, so it was late in his life. It did come into, but that was my role out of it, was telling him, hey, wait a minute, we've got
Yeah.
My mother couldn't have done that. My mother probably would have said, let's try everything in the world, but she knew that there was a certain point to stop.
I'd like
So-
to pick up on that point, the idea of stopping feeding, because a lot of people, and certainly in the Terri Schiavo case, which got so much notoriety, people said, oh, that's so cruel, and you're going to starve this person to death. And in fact, when somebody's dying, they do not want to eat. And in fact, forcing feeding causes more distress than not. And it's actually a very peaceful and not painful way to die. And it can be used both in a situation like that where somebody is comatose and can't eat for themselves, but it's also an option that somebody has in any situation that you can refuse food and hydration, and that is a right, and that is a right that's pretty well recognized in the law. But you sometimes do need somebody to stand up and on your behalf.
The Terri Schiavo case, of course, put before us people who did not put in writing.
Right.
And you can have an oral, but that certainly is an oral instruction is subjective to whoever is listening to
Right,
it. If
and
all family members agree, you're okay, but
Right.
if one disagrees.
And
is
that was a he said, she said kind of a thing. And
so for somebody who's 20 years old, going to college, how old was Terri Schiavo when she was in her mid-20s?
yeah,
23?
I think she was in her late 20s, and then she
Yeah.
was kept on tubes for, 8 or so years, I think.
So they have to do their health care directive, even if it's a simple one, which is, if I'm comatose, I don't want to be on this, in a vegetative state, I do not want to be given artificial hydration or food. That's at least a basic that they should
Yeah.
include.
And, I mean, we would recommend, obviously, the same form, filling out the same form, because all those details would be important at any age.
Yeah.
And then you have to revise, take a look at it every so
Yeah.
often to update it as
As
need
you-
be.
Yeah. Just before, if somebody actually has the opinion that they want hydration in those situations,
Just say so.
that's a family member who might say, well, wait a minute, they're a vegetative state, we don't want to keep them going. They have the right to say that they would like all
Yeah.
circumstances done.
Right.
And Compassionate Choices supports
and
that.
We absolutely, the whole point is that you have that right to choose, and it's not something that should be imposed by other outside people, by religious groups, by legal means.
Well, now in Minnesota, this didn't really stand much of a case, but in reaction to Terri Schiavo, Minnesota actually tried to enact a law that said if you did not do a health care directive, we will mandate you stay alive.
Right,
And,
right. I call it the force feeding bill, but they called it the starvation and dehydration prevention bill, and they made it sound like an act of mercy. And I want to make clear that that was a bill that was propounded by one of the far-right people who are opposed to any kind of choice in so many areas of our lives and want to impose themselves on our lives. And they were bringing that in several states, and Minnesota being one of them. And not only did they say, well, you had to have a written directive, the way the law was framed, the bill, it could be challenged by anybody, including these outside folks, these right-wing polemicists.
Somebody that has absolutely no idea.
So it'd be very difficult to enforce it, no matter what. Basically, they were going to decide
So it'd
for
be
you.
litigation.
And fortunately, as you say, it died quickly in Minnesota, and it hasn't gotten anywhere in any other states. But there are these folks out there that are going to keep trying.
Yeah.
They're going to keep trying to impose their views on us.
So I want to make sure, what about, we have nationally the Netherlands, which has assisted suicide law.
Mm-hmm.
And the knock against that is that people are putting people to death who are not terminally ill. That's always what people criticize of it. Somehow or other, people are ending up in that the law is being used to get rid of people who the state doesn't like. That is not at all how it works.
I don't think there's any evidence that that is true at all.
So in the Netherlands, their assisted suicide law, it has a number of protections in it.
Oh yes, I mean any place where you have a law, it's going to be safer than having no law. In the United States, in all 50 states, there are physicians who are giving pain relievers, for instance, to help people, that will ease people's suffering, which is great, but it will also probably hasten their deaths. And people are doing a variety of things, but they can't be upfront about it because it's against the law to assist suicide anywhere in the United States, except in Oregon, the one state where they did pass a law that said you can, with lots of safeguards and lots of conditions, go to your physician and get a prescription for medication that will painlessly end your life. If you have to be in a terminal situation, you have to request it, and there's no funny business about it.
So you actually have to be conscious, though.
Yes,
you
and
could not be
right.
You cannot be in a
You have to be able to
vegetated
administer
state.
it yourself, which
Okay.
is a drawback. Now, in the Netherlands, the law is actually a euthanasia, which means the doctor can actually do this to you on request. And again, there are lots of safeguards in it. They have no evidence that it's been abused.
Now
But the feeling is that in the United States there's a lot of resistance to that third party doing it. So probably that's why Compassionate Choices is working for the Oregon-style law, where you request it and do it yourself. Take your own medicine, basically.
And the real reason for the medical community not wanting to do it is this Hippocratic Oath thing. Is that, have you ever studied that or researched it yourself?
I think there's a lot of reasons. There's the, liability. It comes back to liabilities for doctors, nurses, a lot of personal and religious beliefs. Just like with the pharmacists, there's a lot of religious beliefs that are keeping people from wanting to move forward with that. Just a variety of viewpoints. But there's also a lot of physicians who they will not voice their dissupport of this. So it's certainly a split issue. It's not as though there's not medical professionals in support of this.
Right.
The argument is really, how are you providing the best care for your patient? Are you providing the best care by keeping them alive in a state of terminal illness, or because not all illnesses can be relieved of pain.
Right. One of the things that we're concerned with when we talk about end-of-life care is palliative care, the relief of suffering, and it's certainly true that for a lot of people that's what they're worried about. And if they were saying, well, yes, I'd like to have my doctor give me the magic pill at the last moment, it's because they're afraid of the suffering. And indeed, as many people argue, if you remove that concern, then they're not interested in hastening their death. They'll just sort of let it take its course. But there are still some people for whom that's not going to be enough, and there are some people whose suffering is so intractable that it can't be cured. And there are other situations where a person, it's not just the pain, there's a kind of an emotional suffering that goes too as you lose control. If you really have a terminal illness and your body is breaking down bit by bit, some people, those of us who are the control freaks of the world, say, no, I don't want to just become this helpless blob with my body functions going awry and so on. And I want to put an end to it before I get to that point. Yeah. And so that's what I'm saying. That should be my right, but I absolutely don't say that you have to make that choice. If you don't like it, you don't do that. You don't make that choice.
Well, you can say that to the folks out in the audience. I was looking at it from the same way.
We're on the same wavelength here.
But at one point, because we're getting close towards the end, but in Oregon, there hasn't been an avalanche of people.
No.
It's been the opposite.
Right. It's been 8 years, and they've had 246 people have actually done this in all that time. And so it grew for the first couple of years, and now it's at about 30, 31, 35 people a year. And there are a lot of people who go and get the prescriptions and never use them. But just having them, having that, right, is such a relief of anxiety. They can die a much more peaceful death knowing that if I had to, I could take it, but I'm okay. I'm okay so far. And they go naturally with from their disease.
Yeah. Now, Sarah, we're down to about 2 minutes. Is that something that you're going to write a paper on when you've finished with your studies, or that you're interested in this enough, or?
I'm actually already doing that, looking at the process of saying goodbye when people have an impending death, but and how that process works for families.
Well, it could be really, it could be really varied from each family. It's very individual.
Yeah. And important for professionals to understand that.
So your look is to try and communicate to professionals what a lot of us might be going through as individuals. Oh, excellent. Well, we're down to just about a minute left. CompassionAndChoices.org is the national website. Right. Do you want to invite anybody?
I invite everybody to go to that website. It's CompassionAndChoices.org. You'll find lots of information, membership information, how you can get involved in the movement, more about what our goals are.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Janet. The time goes by fast on these programs. And we would like to thank all of you for watching. Minnesota Atheist has a newsletter that we put out 6 times a year. If you contact us, we'd be glad to send you a sample copy. And until next time, thank you. And if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Goodbye.